You know that rider turning heads at the intersection? The one on the latest model, a dashboard that looks borrowed from a fighter jet. And then there's the rider beside him, spoke wheels, a silhouette that hasn't needed redesigning in 60 years. Same traffic light, completely different conversation with history. And if you've ever wondered what's going on in the mind of someone who chooses a classic motorcycle, welcome. Because this isn't about aesthetics. It's about a very specific kind of clarity. Let's start with something most people get wrong. Classic riders aren't romantics. They're realists. Because here's what nobody talks about. A modern motorcycle is built around addition. More power, more features, more assistance, more everything. A classic is built around sufficiency. The machine has exactly what it needs and nothing it doesn't. And that philosophy isn't limitation. It's discipline. And let's be honest about what that discipline reveals. Riding a classic motorcycle means operating something that was considered perfect before the industry decided perfect wasn't sellable twice. A classic rider has answers. And after years with the same machine, your instincts know the difference. Your muscle memory knows. You don't consult the bike, you consult yourself. Psychologists call this cognitive simplification. When the number of variables decreases, the depth of engagement with each one increases. But there's a deeper layer here. Researchers studying what they call object permanence in adult identity have found that long-term relationships with specific physical objects fundamentally shape how people understand continuity and selfhood. Identity. Riding a classic isn't about nostalgia, it's a relationship. And that relationship puts you somewhere most people never get to. Everything around you keeps moving. Technology, trends, expectations. And here's the interesting part. Classic riders never feel the need to defend that. You're out there on something designed decades ago, and you owe no one an explanation. That silence isn't indifference. It's just that at some point, you stopped hearing the noise outside. Somewhere around the third oil change. That gap between what the market says matters and what actually does, that's where classic riders live. They don't call it nostalgia. They call it perspective. Let's talk about what a long ride on a classic motorcycle actually feels like. Because this is where the modern comparison becomes almost irrelevant. The engine settles into its note without drama, and you follow its lead because the machine sets the tempo here, not the algorithm. You roll out onto a road that suddenly looks different beneath you, wider somehow, slower in the best possible sense. And somewhere around the first hour, something happens that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who hasn't sat behind a classic set of handlebars. The visual language of the bike, its proportions, its sounds, its weight distribution, all of it was designed in an era that hadn't yet decided that faster was the only direction worth going. This is what people mean when they talk about riding outside of time. It's not a metaphor. The combination of mechanical honesty, visual permanence, and physical simplicity produces an experience that modern engineering genuinely cannot manufacture. Because choosing a classic is choosing a different relationship with progress. Well, there's an unspoken thing that happens when a classic motorcycle arrives somewhere. People stop. Not to film it necessarily, to look at it. There's a recognition that crosses generations, crosses riding styles, crosses every demographic line the industry uses to segment its market. That silhouette lands differently than anything on a showroom floor. It doesn't compete for attention. It simply receives it. And the rider who brought it there understands something the crowd instinctively feels but rarely articulates. Some things were right the first time. And that dynamic says something about the psychology of classic riders collectively. Modern bike communities tend to organize around brands and release cycles. New model drops, community responds, conversation resets. Classic communities organize around something slower and more durable. Knowledge. Who knows how to source the right parts? Who understands the original engineering intent? The currency isn't newness, it's depth. And depth, unlike firmware, doesn't expire. Now let's talk about the honest part, because there is one. Every classic rider knows the trade-off. You give up the convenience. You give up the seamless ownership experience. Part searches that take weeks. They choose it anyway. Not because they're unaware of the alternative, because they've decided that owning something genuinely irreplaceable matters more than owning something endlessly replaceable. And that's not inconvenience reframed as virtue. That's a value system, arrived at honestly, that the modern market simply has no product for. There's a concept in philosophy called the ship of Theseus. If you replace every part of a ship over time, is it still the same ship? Classic riders live inside that question. Every time they source an original component, every time they choose authenticity over convenience, every time they decide that keeping something true to itself is worth more than keeping it easy. Most people never have to confront that question because everything they own was designed to be replaced entirely. Classic riders confront it in the garage on a Sunday afternoon with grease on their hands and a decision to make. So next time you see someone on a classic motorcycle and think they're simply preserving the past, you're asking the wrong question. The right question is this: when's the last time you chose something because it was right, not because it was current? When's the last time you owned something the world agreed to move on from and decided the world was wrong? Because for classic riders, that's not the stance, that's just the standard.